What truly kept people up at night 1,000 years ago? What terrorized their final years, especially when their bodies grew weak and their minds perhaps started to wander in medieval Europe from the 5th to the 15th century? Number 10. The grim specter of poverty and destitution. For someone living through their later years in medieval Europe, the thought of poverty was not some distant abstract concept. It was a cold, hard shadow that loomed over every harvest, every season, every ache in their bones. When your body began to betray you, the ability to work, to provide for yourself, withered away. Imagine a peasant woman, perhaps named Agnes, her hands gnarled from decades of tilling the unforgiving soil, her back bent from countless hours of planting and harvesting. She had always worked since she was a child. Her life had been defined by the rhythm of the land and the sweat of her brow. But now her eyesight dimmed, her joints screamed with every movement, and the strength that once allowed her to wield a scythe was simply gone. In this world, there was no government pension, no social security check arriving each month. If you could not work, you relied entirely on others. The primary safety net was your family. Your children were expected to care for you in your old age. This was not just a nice idea. It was a deeply ingrained social obligation, often codified in local customs or even wills. A son might inherit the family farm, but with the explicit understanding that his aging parents would live with him, receive food, shelter and care until their dying day. Sometimes this arrangement worked, bringing generations together under one roof. But what if Agnes had no surviving children? Or what if her children themselves succumbed to disease or famine or war, leaving her utterly alone? The records from medieval England and France sometimes reveal snippets of these desperate situations. Parish accounts from villages mention occasional relief provided to the impotent poor, those unable to work due to age or infirmity. This was often meager, perhaps a small allowance of grain or a few pennies, barely enough to stave off starvation. Monasteries and almshouses also offered a measure of charity. These institutions, often founded by wealthy benefactors, provided shelter and food for a limited number of the elderly poor. But these places were few and far between, and the demand far outstripped the supply. To gain entry, one often needed connections, or to prove an extreme level of piety, or simply to be incredibly lucky. A person like Agnes might walk for days, her feet swollen and raw, to reach the gates of a distant abbey only to be turned away because every bed was full. The alternative to family or formal charity was begging. To wander the roads, to sit outside church doors, holding out a withered hand, was a common fate for those who had nothing left. It meant public humiliation, exposure to the elements, and constant hunger. It meant relying on the sporadic kindness of strangers, often just a crust of bread or a sip of watered-down ale. Medieval society, while valuing charity, also viewed vagrancy with suspicion. Laws against sturdy beggars, those deemed able to work but choosing not to, were harsh. Even for the genuinely infirm, life on the road was precarious. They were vulnerable to bandits, to harsh weather, to disease. Consider the case of a former artisan, perhaps a cooper, who made barrels. His hands, once skilled and nimble, now trembled uncontrollably, and his eyesight prevented him from seeing the fine details of his craft. His customers would simply go elsewhere without his trade. His income vanished. If he had no apprentices to take over his workshop, no children to support him, his world would shrink to nothing. He could not simply retire on savings. The concept of a savings account for old age was practically non-existent for the common person. Every day was about subsistence. A few coins might be kept under a floorboard, but they were for emergencies, not for a comfortable decline. The fear of being unable to care for oneself, of becoming a burden, of facing a slow, drawn-out demise from hunger and exposure was deeply ingrained. It was a fear that compelled people to work until their bodies broke, to cling to their children, to pray for a quick death rather than a lingering, impoverished one. The legal documents of the time, such as wills, sometimes reflect this concern, with testators meticulously outlining provisions for elderly parents or widowed spouses, hoping to secure their comfort and ward off the horror of destitution. They knew too well what could happen if such provisions were not made. If the threads of family and community support frayed, leaving an aged person utterly alone in a world that had little mercy for those who could no longer contribute. This was the ever-present, bone-chilling reality that could steal away any peace an older person might hope to find. Number 9. The relentless agony of sickness without remedy. Imagine living in a time when a simple cut could be a death sentence, and a common cold could quickly morph into a fatal chest infection. For the elderly in medieval Europe, the fear of sickness was not just about discomfort. It was about prolonged suffering, debilitating pain, and an almost certain, often agonizing end. Their bodies were already weakened by years of hard labor, poor nutrition, and exposure to the elements. Their immune systems, if such a concept were even known, were often compromised. When illness struck, there were few effective defenses. The understanding of disease was rudimentary at best. The prevailing theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, was the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be an imbalance of these humors. Treatments often involved attempts to restore this balance, such as bloodletting, cupping, or purging. A barber surgeon, often more barber than surgeon, might make an incision to drain what was believed to be excess blood, regardless of the actual ailment. This practice, while seemingly logical at the time, frequently weakened an already frail patient, making them more susceptible to infection or further complications. Think of an older man, perhaps a former stonemason named Thomas, whose knees had long since given out, and who now suffered from a persistent, hacking cough. Modern medicine would diagnose pneumonia, perhaps treatable with antibiotics. But for Thomas there was no such thing. A local healer might prescribe herbal remedies, perhaps a brew of horehound or licorice root which might soothe the throat but would do nothing to combat the bacterial infection ravaging his lungs. The healer might suggest warming plasters or specific diets, but the fundamental cause of his distress remained a mystery. Thomas would lie on his straw mattress, gasping for breath, the coughing fits racking his entire body, knowing there was little anyone could truly do. Chronic conditions were particularly brutal. Arthritis, rheumatism, persistent coughs, tooth decay, leading to painful abscesses, and impaired vision were common afflictions of old age. These were not mere inconveniences. They were sources of constant gnawing pain that could make even simple tasks impossible. An elderly woman whose eyesight was failing could no longer spin wool, a crucial contribution to her household. A man crippled by gout could not walk to the fields, let alone work them. Pain management was practically non-existent, beyond rudimentary. Herbal painkillers like opium poppy, which was often only available to the very wealthy, or alcohol. Many simply endured constant agony. The lack of basic hygiene also contributed to the spread of disease. Clean water was not always readily available, and sanitation systems were primitive or non-existent. Open sewers in towns, infrequent bathing, and the close proximity of people and animals created fertile ground for pathogens. A small cut on an elderly person's hand sustained while chopping firewood could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene and eventual death, all because there was no understanding of germs or antiseptics. Then there were the great scourges like the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it did not discriminate by age. However, the elderly, with their already compromised health, were particularly vulnerable. They were less likely to recover from the initial symptoms, and their weakened bodies simply could not fight off the virulent disease. Accounts from chronicles describe entire villages, decimated with the old and frail among the first to perish. The fear of these terrifying epidemics was not just about dying, but about the horrific symptoms, the agonizing swellings, the fever, the vomiting, the knowledge that medical help was useless. Even for those who could afford a physician, their knowledge was limited. A medieval doctor, often trained at universities like Salerno or Paris, might be learned in classical texts, but lacked practical anatomical knowledge or germ theory. Their fees were steep, putting them out of reach for most of the aging population. So an elderly person faced sickness with resignation, knowing that their suffering would likely be prolonged, and that death was often the only release. This persistent, physical struggle against unseen enemies was a defining dread for many. Number 8. The chilling silence of isolation and abandonment. In medieval Europe, a person's life was deeply interwoven with their community and family. From birth to death, most people lived in close proximity to others, relying on a network of kin, neighbors, and fellow villagers for support, sustenance, and companionship. For the elderly, the thought of being cut off from this vital web, of facing their final years utterly alone, was a profound and unsettling fear. It was not just about loneliness, it was about vulnerability, about the loss of dignity, and about the prospect of a neglected death. Consider an elderly widow, perhaps named Alara, who had lived her entire life in the same small hamlet. She had raised children, seen grandchildren born, and participated in countless harvests, weddings, and funerals. Her husband had passed years ago, and her children, seeking better opportunities, had perhaps moved to a larger town or even a different region, a journey that might take weeks and be fraught with danger. Communication was slow and infrequent, often relying on passing travelers or merchants. Letters were a luxury if they were written at all, and a visit might happen only once a year. If that, Ilara might find herself living in her small cottage, surrounded by familiar fields and faces, but increasingly isolated from the very people who were her closest kin. The family unit was indeed the primary social security system. Children were expected to care for their aging parents. However, life in the Middle Ages was brutal and unpredictable. The average lifespan was short, and infant mortality rates were incredibly high. It was entirely possible for an older person to outlive all their children, or to have their children die prematurely from disease or accident. A plague could sweep through a family, leaving an elderly parent as the sole survivor. War could claim sons, leaving their parents bereft of their primary support. If a spouse passed away, especially if the elderly person was a woman, the risk of isolation increased dramatically. Women tended to outlive men, and while they might retain property rights, managing a household or a farm alone in old age was a monumental task. Without a partner or children actively present, the practicalities of daily life became overwhelming. Who would fetch water from the well, chop firewood, tend the small garden? Who would offer a comforting word when the darkness of night pressed in? Medieval society was not equipped for independent living for the very old and frail. There were no home care services, no meals on wheels. Neighbors might offer assistance, but their own lives were often hard-filled with their own struggles. They could not always provide consistent, dedicated care. As an elderly person's physical abilities declined, their world might shrink further. The walk to the market might become too arduous. The journey to church impossible. They would become confined to their small dwelling. their connection to the outside world reduced to the occasional visit from a charitable neighbor or a passing priest. The fear was palpable in the wills and testaments of the era. Wealthy individuals would often make explicit provisions for their elderly relatives, ensuring they would not be left to fend for themselves. Sometimes, property was bequeathed with the condition that the new owner provide lodging, food, and care for an aged parent or sibling. These legal arrangements speak volumes about the societal anxieties surrounding the care of the elderly. They tried to legally bind care because they knew the alternative. The ultimate dread was to die alone. In a deeply religious society, dying unconfessed, without the last rites, was a terrifying prospect. But beyond the spiritual implications, dying alone meant no one to close your eyes, no one to mourn your passing, no one to prepare your body for burial. Your death might go unnoticed for days, even weeks, a grim thought in a world that valued communal living. A body might be discovered by chance, a silent testament to a life that had ended without comfort or witness. This slow fade from community, the loss of human connection, and the cold reality of ending one's days in solitude was a profound source of dread for the elderly. Number 7. The slow erosion of status and respect. In the tapestry of medieval European society, age often brought with it a certain gravitas and respect. Elders were seen as repositories of wisdom, tradition, and experience. They held the memories of the community, the knowledge of past harvests, ancient customs, and family histories. They were the storytellers, the advisors, the upholders of norms, but this respect, while idealized, was also fragile. For many elderly people, a creeping fear was the loss of this hard-won status, the quiet diminishing of their voice, and the painful reality of becoming a burden rather than a beacon of wisdom. Imagine a village elder, perhaps a former reeve or a respected landholder named Idwig. For decades, his words carried weight in the village council. Younger men sought his advice on planting schedules, on resolving disputes, on interpreting local customary law. His white beard and weathered face were symbols of authority and deep understanding. However, as Edwig aged, his memory began to falter. He might forget names, repeat stories, or become confused about recent events. His physical strength waned, preventing him from participating in communal tasks like building or road repair. Slowly, subtly, the younger generation would begin to bypass him. Their eyes would drift to their own peers when seeking solutions, or they might humor him with a polite nod while quietly making their own decisions. This shift was rarely overt or malicious. It was a natural progression, but one that could be deeply painful for the individual experiencing it. The control over their own affairs, which they had exercised for a lifetime, would gradually slip away. For a peasant family, the eldest son would typically take over the management of the farm when his father became too old or infirm. While this transition was necessary for the family's survival, it meant the patriarch ceded his authority, moving from decision-maker to dependent. His advice might still be sought, but the final choice rested with the younger generation. His once powerful position within the household was now diminished. Property was a key element of power and status. An elderly person who had managed to retain ownership of their land or workshop held a greater degree of leverage and respect. However, many land arrangements were based on custom, and the ability to work the land was paramount. If an elderly person could no longer physically contribute, their claim to the land could be challenged, or they might be pressured to transfer it to a younger, more capable family member in exchange for their ongoing care. This transfer, while providing security, often came at the cost of independence and, by extension, respect. Even within the church, a revered institution, age could bring a decline in influence. An aging priest, whose voice grew weak and whose memory for scripture faltered, might find his parishioners seeking guidance from younger, more vibrant clergy. While the institution itself respected its elders, individual frailties could not be ignored. The literature and proverbs of the time sometimes reflect a nuanced view of old age. While wisdom was extolled, the frailties of old age, such as dotage or physical weakness, were also recognized, sometimes with pity, sometimes with a hint of disdain. The fear for the elderly was not just about being physically incapable, but about what that incapacity meant for their standing in the eyes of their peers and their families. To be seen as a burden, as someone whose time had passed, whose contributions were no longer relevant, was a deeply humiliating prospect. The loss of status extended to social interactions. An elderly man might find himself no longer invited to the village feast, or perhaps seated at the children's table rather than among the men of standing. An old woman might find her opinions on child-rearing or household management quietly disregarded by her daughters-in-law. The subtle slights, the gentle sidestepping, the growing silence around them, all contributed to a profound sense of diminishment. For those who had once commanded respect and exerted influence, this gradual erosion of their standing was a chilling forecast of their approaching irrelevance, and ultimately, their forgotten end. Number 6. The fiery torment of damnation and eternal hellfire. In medieval Europe, the Christian faith was not just a part of life. It was the framework for existence, the lens through which the world was understood, and the ultimate determinant of one's eternal fate. For the elderly, whose lives were drawing to a close, the fear of divine judgment and the terrifying prospect of eternal damnation in hellfire was a profoundly real and overwhelming dread. This was not a metaphorical concept. It was a literal burning reality, depicted in art, preached from pulpits, and believed with absolute conviction. Imagine a man named Gerard, perhaps a former merchant, lying on his deathbed. His life had been full of dealings, some honest, some perhaps less so. He might have been quick to anger, or perhaps he harbored resentments against rivals. Throughout his life he participated in the sacraments, attended Mass, and tried to live right. But as death approached, the weight of a lifetime of sins, both great and small, pressed down upon him. Every lie, every unkind word, every moment of pride or envy came rushing back. The Church taught that after death each soul faced a particular judgment, where God would weigh their actions. The destination would be one of 3 places: heaven for the truly righteous, purgatory for those who needed purification before entering heaven, and hell for the unforgiven and unrepentant sinners. The imagery of hell was vivid and terrifying, depicted in countless frescoes, illuminated manuscripts, and stained glass windows across Europe. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch, even slightly later, drew on these established fears. Lakes of fire, demons with pitchforks, tortured souls experiencing unending pain, a realm of perpetual darkness, wailing and gnashing of teeth. Sermons from itinerant preachers and local priests alike painted equally graphic pictures, ensuring that every soul understood the stakes. The crucial importance of dying in a state of grace, reconciled with God, cannot be overstated. This meant receiving the last rites, confession, anointing of the sick, and Holy Communion. To die unshriven, without having confessed one's sins and received absolution from a priest, was a terrifying prospect. It meant facing God's judgment with the full burden of one's transgressions, virtually guaranteeing a descent into hell. This is why the presence of a priest at the deathbed was so critical, and why elaborate rituals evolved around the art of dying, or ars moriendi, providing instructions on how to face death with piety and repentance. For the elderly, who had lived longer, the accumulation of sins was a greater burden. They had more years to have strayed, more opportunities to have erred. The fear of forgotten sins, or of sins committed in their youth that had never been truly repented for, was a constant source of anxiety. They might spend their final years consumed by religious devotion, praying constantly, performing acts of charity, and making elaborate wills to secure masses for their souls after death. These acts were not just out of piety. They were desperate attempts to mitigate their eternal fate. The concept of purgatory offered a glimmer of hope, a place of purification where sins could be atoned for through suffering. But it was still a place of intense pain, a temporary hell. For many, even the thought of purgatory was dreadful. The hope was to spend as little time there as possible, and the length of one's stay could be shortened by prayers from the living pilgrimages and the purchase of indulgences, which granted remission of temporal punishment for sins. Wealthy individuals would leave vast sums in their wills for perpetual masses to be said for their souls, hoping to hasten their passage through purgatory. The dance of death imagery, which became particularly popular after the Black Death, visually depicted the universality of death, with figures from all walks of life, kings, peasants, popes, and merchants, being led away by a skeletal death. For the elderly, this was a reminder that their time was truly short, and that the moment of ultimate reckoning was approaching rapidly. The omnipresent church bells tolling for the dead served as constant reminders of mortality and the looming judgment. The fear of hell was deeply psychological, manifesting as an intense spiritual torment. It was not just a fear of physical pain, but of eternal separation from God, of never-ending despair. This spiritual dread was perhaps one of the most powerful and pervasive fears for the elderly, transcending the physical hardships of their daily lives and reaching into the very core of their eternal being. Number 5. The gnawing scourge of famine and starvation. In a world where agriculture was the backbone of society and technology was limited, the fear of famine was not a distant possibility, but a recurrent nightmare. For the elderly, whose strength had dwindled and whose ability to secure food had diminished, the threat of starvation was an even more immediate and terrifying reality. When the crops failed, the old and frail were often the first to suffer, and the least likely to recover. Imagine a succession of cold, wet springs followed by scorching, dry summers. The grain crops, the very foundation of sustenance, wither in the fields. This was not uncommon in medieval Europe. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler climate that began around the 14th century, brought more frequent extreme weather events. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, devastated vast swaths of northern Europe, leading to widespread death and immense suffering. Chronicles from that period speak of incessant rains, ruined harvests, and people resorting to eating roots, bark, and even in desperate cases, cannibalism. For an older person, say a peasant woman named Isolde, who had spent her life relying on the yield of her small plot of land, a failed harvest meant immediate and dire consequences. She no longer had the strength to go out and forage for wild edibles, or to compete with younger, stronger individuals for scarce resources. Her grandchildren, perhaps, were thin and hungry, and any food she managed to acquire would likely be given to them first. She might go days, then weeks on starvation rations, her body wasting away, her bones becoming brittle. The medieval diet, even in good times, was often monotonous and lacked essential nutrients. For the elderly, who needed easily digestible and nourishing food, this was a particular challenge. If the harvest was poor, the available food would be even less varied and often less healthy. Chronic malnutrition weakened the body further, making it highly susceptible to disease. A cough, a fever, or a common infection that a younger, healthier person might shrug off could be fatal for an older person already weakened by hunger. Food shortages also led to soaring prices. What little grain or meat was available became prohibitively expensive for the common person, especially those who no longer earned wages or had no produce to sell. Wealthy landowners might hoard grain, waiting for prices to rise further, exacerbating the suffering of the poor. The elderly, with no means to buy food, faced an impossible choice: beg, steal, or starve. Begging, as discussed before, offered little guarantee and was often dehumanizing. Stealing carried harsh penalties, including mutilation or even death, a risk few elderly could afford to take, especially if they were too frail to escape capture. During times of famine, community bonds could fray under the immense pressure. While some communities organized relief efforts, others might see every person as a competitor for dwindling resources. An elderly person who was no longer seen as contributing could in extreme circumstances become marginalized or even abandoned as families botanist. The survival of their productive members, this was a grim calculus of survival. People's bodies became skeletal, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, if at all, conserving every ounce of energy. The air would fill with the stench of sickness and death. For the elderly, who had seen many harvests and many winters, the signs of impending famine were unmistakable, a dreadful premonition of their own slow decline and painful end. The fear was visceral, a constant ache in the belly, a memory of past hunger that lingered even in times of plenty, knowing that at any moment the fragile balance could tip and the specter of starvation would return. Number 4. The brute reality of violence, banditry, and war. Medieval Europe was a landscape perpetually scarred by conflict. Wars between kingdoms, feuds between noble families, and the pervasive threat of banditry made life unpredictable and often brutally short. For the elderly, whose physical strength and mobility were diminished, the prospect of violence was a particularly terrifying fear. They were often unable to defend themselves, to flee, or to recover from the devastation wrought by human conflict. Imagine a quiet village nestled beside a river, its inhabitants going about their daily lives. An elderly couple, perhaps a retired miller and his wife, lived there, their world defined by the familiar rhythms of the seasons. Then, without warning, the distant sound of trumpets breaks the peace, or the shouts of armed men on horseback echo through the valley. It could be a raiding party from a neighboring lord's lands, a band of disgruntled mercenaries or soldiers from a distant war campaign, foraging for supplies. These forces often acted with impunity, seizing food, livestock, and valuables. For the elderly, such an event meant immediate peril. They lacked the speed to escape into the woods or to seek refuge in a fortified castle, assuming one was even nearby. Their homes, often poorly constructed, offered no protection. They were vulnerable targets, easily robbed of any meager possessions they might have accumulated. Their physical frailty made them susceptible to injury, and a simple shove could result in a broken bone, a potentially fatal injury in a world without modern medicine. Banditry was a constant threat, especially on trade routes and in sparsely populated areas. Disbanded soldiers, desperate peasants, or professional criminals formed gangs that preyed on travelers in isolated settlements. An elderly person traveling perhaps to visit a relative or to a market would be an easy mark, their lack of defense making them prime targets for robbery or worse. The fear of being set upon in a dark forest path, of having one's life's meager savings stolen, and of being left injured or exposed, was a pervasive anxiety. Warfare itself was not just confined to battlefields. Armies lived off the land, foraging and requisitioning supplies from local populations. This often meant homes were ransacked, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered or driven off. For the elderly, whose ability to work the land was limited, the loss of their home and livelihood was catastrophic. They might become displaced, forced to wander the ravaged countryside, seeking shelter and sustenance from communities already struggling. Accounts from the 100 Years' War, for example, describe entire regions laid waste with civilians, including the old, bearing the brunt of the conflict. The impact of violence was not just immediate physical harm, it was the destruction of one's entire world. A lifetime of work could be undone in a single day. A small farm, cultivated for generations, could be burned to the ground. The animals, which represented both food and wealth, could be stolen, for the elderly rebuilding was often impossible. They lacked the physical capacity, the resources, and often the will to start anew. They might be left with nothing but memories of a life that had been violently ripped away. Even the feudal system itself, which was meant to provide protection, could be a source of violence. Local lords often engaged in private wars or feuds with their neighbors, dragging their peasants into the conflict. An elderly tenant farmer might find their lord demanding military service from their sons, leaving them vulnerable and alone on the land. Or their village might become a battleground, caught between opposing forces. The fear was of being collateral damage, a forgotten statistic in a larger struggle, their quiet existence suddenly shattered by the brutal realities of a martial age. The constant threat of physical harm, the destruction of property, and the forced displacement created a profound sense of insecurity. For the elderly, this translated into a persistent dread that their final years, already fraught with challenge, could be brought to an abrupt and brutal end by the unpredictable and savage acts of men. Number 3. The slow decay of mental faculties or physical ability. To lose one's mind, to no longer recognize loved ones, or to become entirely dependent on others due to physical breakdown, was a deeply unsettling fear for the elderly in medieval Europe. This was a time when little was understood about conditions like dementia, stroke, or severe arthritis. These afflictions were often seen as a natural, albeit terrifying part of old age, or even sometimes attributed to divine displeasure or malevolent influences. The fear was not just of the physical pain, but of the profound loss of self-dignity and independence. Imagine an older woman, perhaps a respected village midwife named Marjorie, whose mind had always been sharp, her hands steady. She knew every herb, every remedy, every birthing trick, but as she aged, her memory began to slip. She might forget the names of her long-time neighbors or misplace her precious herbal remedies. Her hands, once so nimble, now trembled uncontrollably, and her movements became slow and uncertain. She might wander aimlessly, disoriented, or speak nonsense. For someone like Marjorie, the decline of her mental faculties meant the loss of her identity, her livelihood, and her respect within the community. Her skills, once invaluable, would become unreliable. People would stop seeking her help, not out of malice, but out of necessity. She would transition from being an active, respected member of society to someone who needed constant supervision. A burden on her family. Physical decline was equally feared. Years of hard labor, often without proper nutrition or rest, took a heavy toll on the body. Many older people suffered from severe joint pain, chronic back problems, or debilitating weakness. A fall, common in the elderly, could easily result in a broken hip or leg, which, without modern surgical intervention, could lead to prolonged immobility, infection, and likely death. To be bedridden meant complete dependency, a state of profound vulnerability. There was no understanding of cognitive diseases. What we call dementia might have been referred to as dotage or senility, seen as a natural winding down of the brain. While sometimes treated with compassion, there was also a pervasive fear, and sometimes even superstition, around erratic behavior. An elderly person acting strangely might be seen as possessed or cursed or simply losing their mind in a way that was unsettling to those around them. This could lead to social isolation even within their own family as people struggled to understand or cope with the changes. The loss of independence was a particularly bitter pill. For a lifetime, an individual had been master of their own fate, at least within the confines of their social class. They made decisions about their land, their household, their children, but with mental or physical decline, these decisions would be taken over by younger family members. The elder's property might be managed by a son or nephew, their daily care dictated by others. This loss of autonomy, of being able to control even the simplest aspects of one's life, was deeply disheartening. Wingibility to exploitation was another grim possibility. An elderly person with failing memory or judgment could be easily tricked or manipulated by unscrupulous relatives or neighbors who might try to seize their property or belongings. Without a sharp mind to protect their interests, they were at the mercy of others. Legal arrangements could be made for the care of the incapacitated, often placing them under the guardianship of a younger family member, but this was a formal acknowledgement of their loss of control. The descriptions in medieval literature, even fictional ones, sometimes hint at this fear. Characters might lament their failing sight or memory, or depict aged figures as helpless and reliant. This was not merely a literary device. It reflected a lived reality and a deep-seated anxiety about the inevitable decline. For the elderly, the fear was not just of death, but of a prolonged state of living death, where their mind or body, or both, would betray them, stripping away their identity and leaving them utterly dependent, and perhaps even unnoticed. Number 2, the dark shadow of being accused of witchcraft. In a world steeped in superstition and a profound belief in the supernatural, an inexplicable misfortune, a sudden illness, or a string of bad luck could easily be attributed to malevolent forces. For the elderly, particularly women living alone or those who were perceived as unusual, the chilling fear of being accused of witchcraft was a very real and dangerous possibility. Such an accusation could quickly spiral into social ostracism, torture, and even a horrific death. Imagine an old woman named Bertha, living on the fringes of a small village. She might have been a healer, skilled with herbs and traditional remedies, a source of comfort for some, but also of unease for others. Perhaps her demeanor was a bit eccentric, or she lived alone, or she had a habit of talking to herself. Then, a cow falls ill, a child develops a mysterious fever, or a harvest inexplicably fails. In a pre-scientific age, explanations were sought in the unseen world. Whispers would begin. Bertha was seen near the sick cow. Her eyes looked strange. She never goes to church. While large-scale witch hunts became more prevalent in the early modern period, the roots of suspicion and localized accusations were firmly medieval. The belief in maleficium, or harmful magic, was widespread. It was thought that certain individuals could use supernatural powers to cause illness, blight crops, or bring about misfortune. Elderly women, especially widows who were independent or lacked male protection, were particularly vulnerable targets. Their age might make them seem more mysterious or less subject to normal social rules. Their isolation could be interpreted as sinister. If an accusation gained traction, the consequences were dire. There was no presumption of innocence. Accused individuals might be subjected to trials by ordeal, practices believed to reveal divine judgment. For instance, an elderly woman might be tied up and thrown into a pond to see if she floated, a sign of guilt, as the water was believed to reject the impure, or sank, a sign of innocence but often leading to drowning. These methods were designed to be impossible to pass without injury or death, making any accusation a de facto condemnation. The fear was compounded by the powerlessness of the accused. Most Elderly people, especially the poor, lacked the resources or connections to defend themselves against such charges. Their word carried little weight against the collective fear and superstition of a terrified community. Neighbors, once familiar, could turn into accusers, their fear overcoming any prior kindness or acquaintance. A lifetime of quiet living could be undone by a single, unfounded rumor. Local court records, though sparse for these types of accusations, sometimes hint at individuals being tried for various forms of magic or sorcery. Though not always leading to death, the social consequences were ruinous. Once branded a witch, a person would be shunned, feared, and often driven from their home. They might be forced to wander the countryside, with no one daring to offer them shelter or food, lest they too fall under suspicion. The fear was not only of direct accusation, but of the general atmosphere of suspicion. An older person might avoid certain behaviors or isolate themselves even further, just to avoid drawing unwanted attention. They might refrain from making pronouncements or expressing opinions or even offering remedies that could be misconstrued as magic. Their knowledge of folk remedies, once valued, could now become a dangerous liability. This fear was psychological, preying on the deep-seated anxieties of a superstitious age. It was the fear of being scapegoated for the misfortunes of others, of being branded an agent of evil, and of facing a terrifying, unjust punishment at the hands of a fearful mob or a prejudiced court. For an elderly person, their physical vulnerability compounded this danger, making them easy targets for a community looking for someone to blame. To be seen as a witch meant losing not just your life, but your soul, your reputation, and everything you held dear, leaving behind a legacy of fear and loathing. Number 1. The dread of a bad death or dying alone. For the elderly in medieval Europe, the ultimate fear, perhaps encompassing all others, was not just death itself, but the circumstances of their dying. To die a bad death, suddenly, violently, unconfessed, or most terrifyingly alone, was a profound source of spiritual and existential dread. The ideal death was a carefully managed affair, surrounded by family, reconciled with God, and prepared for the journey into the afterlife. Anything less was a cause for immense anxiety. Imagine an older man, perhaps a farmer named Cuthbert, who had lived a simple but devout life. He knew his time was coming, and he longed for a good death. This meant first and foremost having the opportunity to confess all his sins to a priest, receive absolution, and partake in Holy Communion, the viaticum for the final journey. It meant receiving the anointing of the sick, a sacred blessing that prepared the soul for its departure. These sacraments were believed to be absolutely crucial for ensuring passage to heaven, or at least minimizing time in purgatory. To die suddenly, perhaps, in an accident in the fields, or unexpectedly in his sleep, without these final rites, was a terrifying thought. It meant facing God's judgment with unconfessed sins, increasing the risk of damnation. The visual culture of the time reinforced this fear. Medieval art often depicted scenes of deathbeds, showing angels battling demons for the soul of the dying, with the presence of a priest administering the sacraments as a crucial defense against the forces of evil. The ars moriendi, or art of dying, was a popular genre of texts and woodcuts that instructed the dying and their caregivers on how to achieve a good death. It emphasized patience, faith, and the avoidance of despair and worldly attachments, all aimed at securing a peaceful transition. But beyond the spiritual, there was the profound fear of dying alone. In a society where community and family were paramount, to breathe one's last breath without a loved one present was deeply unsettling. Who would close your eyes? Who would say the final prayers? Who would ensure your body was treated with respect and prepared for burial according to Christian custom? to be found cold and stiff days later, unmourned and unblessed, was a deeply humiliating prospect. This was not just about companionship. It was about ensuring the proper spiritual transition. The practicalities of a lonely death were also grim. If one died alone in their home, their death might go unnoticed for days or even weeks, especially for the very isolated elderly. The body might decompose, making proper burial difficult and adding to the indignity. There would be no one to witness the death, no one to carry out last wishes, no one to comfort the dying moments. The fear was also of a long, painful, and drawn-out death. As discussed, medieval medicine offered little relief for suffering. To linger for weeks or months, in agonizing pain, unable to find peace, was a dreadful prospect. While the Church taught the value of suffering as a form of penance, the physical reality was horrifying. The desire for a quick, if not peaceful end, was often expressed in prayers and wills, reflecting the anxiety of prolonged torment. Wills often meticulously detailed burial instructions, where the body should be laid to rest, what prayers should be said, how many masses should be offered for the soul. These weren't just about pomp. They were about controlling the narrative of one's death, ensuring that even in death one was part of the community, and that their soul was given the best possible chance at salvation. To die a bad death meant these careful preparations would be for naught. The ringing of church bells, a constant presence in medieval life, served as a perpetual reminder of mortality. Different tolls signified different stages of death, from the passing of a soul to the funeral procession. For the elderly, these bells were not just background noise. They were a direct, constant reminder that their own bell would soon toll. And the critical question was how their final moments would unfold. This pervasive fear of a bad death, of dying alone and unforgiven, was the ultimate shadow that followed the elderly through their final years.